Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Mount Vernon Livestream. My name is Steve Bashore. I'm the Director of Historic Trades and in charge of the grist mill, distillery, the farm, and our blacksmith shop. We have a great program for you this evening with Justin Cherry, chef and 18th century baker. Before we bring Justin on the screen, we wanted to show a short video, and we'll get into more depth once we get started. Excellent information tonight about foodways in the 18th century, so let's go ahead and watch that video first, and then we'll talk to Justin. There he is. How are you doing tonight, Justin?
Very good. How are you?
Doing well. I wanted to give a little bit of your background so everyone watching can understand your journey. You're a chef and owner of Half Crown Bakehouse. We saw your oven in that video. So
right.
That's a business that you started about 3 years ago. But prior to that, you were a chef at a number of restaurants, even working overseas, I know. Then very deep into history, very deep as a researcher, and this led you to really discovering a journey through 18th century foodways and baking and what happened in this North American continent with that. I also know that you're an excellent researcher, and what brought you to Mount Vernon was you were a library fellow at the Fred W. Smith Library for the Study of George Washington, and digging deeply into foodways. So that's where you and I met, and I know that research is ongoing. I'll also note on a side note that you also hold several football records in the state of Pennsylvania, which was the other part of your career when you were a younger guy. But welcome to the live stream, and thanks for being here for the Mount Vernon members.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for having me.
And of course, that video that was shot was just last October. That was your bake oven and set up at the farm for harvest days. And I think that before we get into a little bit of eating in the 18th century, maybe you should just tell them a little bit about the history of the oven and that work just briefly.
Right. Yeah. So the oven itself is designed after an oven or description of an oven that I researched and found in Georgia, coastal Georgia, a settlement of German Lutherans that came to the area in the early 1730s. And they also built the first grist mills in Georgia. Now, along with these grist mills, they needed something to make the bread. So they had at least 3 to 4 of these large scale ovens that were built of clay. Now, these clay ovens, they were quite common up and down the East Coast, even as far as New France and down into Spanish Florida at the time. And they were usually constructed of clay and sometimes quick mortar from the river bends and also some lime. Now, these ovens were popular not only on large-scale plantations, but also military outposts, something that they could throw up and build to feed soldiers on short campaigns during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And my oven came into play that I had built it on top of a trailer so it could be fully mobile to transport it to historic sites and educate the public on baking and historic grains using that type of oven.
And you've recently helped us construct one on the farm at Mount Vernon this year. So that's been a great project that's going to follow in your footsteps. So, but to get back into the deep topic that you study so well is eating in the 18th century. And one of the things I wanted to start with is the distribution of class and wealth and how foodways entered in at different levels depending on what part of society someone might be in class with.
Right. Just to touch very briefly on each kind of class, you can start with the enslaved workers. A lot of cornmeal, salted fish, and salted meats. More fish than meats, but cornmeal a lot of the times. And then during the 1780s, Virginia saw a lot of corn shortages. So other things were implemented, such as rye, or even middlings, ship middlings, or ship stuff that was traditionally used for for biscuits that was bolted out of the flour. Now, the lower class above that, we're used to more like one pot meals, soups and stews that were consistent of salted meats, maybe a few vegetables, and probably some grain. As you work into the middle class, you're seeing a little bit more of the same thing, but maybe some of the things that they farm themselves or hunted with. So you're seeing a lot of game if they're out close to the frontier, or they're buying or trading for some goods in town. And as we move into the wealthy, you see a large amount of imported goods, especially before the Revolution. Up until the late 1760s, 3/4 of the things that the wealthy were getting were all imported, including, biscuits and bread, beer and wine and liquor, and all these things were imported through trade.
And I think at Mount Vernon, we reflect that with our foodways program between what you might see at the Pioneer Farm site versus the discussions in the historic area around the mansion and the Washingtons, and the wonderful book I know that you've seen, the Dining with the Washingtons.
Right. Correct.
Really shows that era at the higher class. A lot of people tend to think a plantation was self-sustaining. That's a notion that we get, but your discussion just now about importation, there were things they could provide, but again, a lot of it's through trade, through the Caribbean, through back to Europe, correct?
Right. I think that's a common fallacy with large plantation owners, that they can sustain themselves and even the enslaved workers that are there on their crop alone. And that's just not true, because with the importation of goods and even buying of cornmeal and other things like that to feed hired workers and enslaved workers alike, I think a very good example of that, especially coming from Washington, was in the late 1790s, when he refers to that he has 101 cows and he has to buy butter for his family.
Yeah, there's that quote is quite humorous in that letter, and I think he is also wondering what's leaving on 2 feet, as he used to say.
Right.
Now, today we generally eat. We're going to eat Thursday. All of us will have a big meal. It might be different times for different families, but
Right.
What was dinner or supper? Those are different terms back then. But what was the times for certain meals in the 18th century?
Right. So breakfast, usually occurred between 7 and 8 o'clock. Washington, I think, usually liked to eat around 7. Now, moving on towards the day, dinner would be more like 2 to 3 o'clock, and then followed by a light meal, usually tea. What they called tea was usually consisting of like a light meal. And then moving forward, supper sometimes was 8 or 9 o'clock. And then, consecutively, those dinners at that late in the day, some of the things that they consisted of, roasted meats and butchered meats is what they referred to them as. The next day for breakfast, you would most likely eat what you had for dinner the night before. You'd be eating for breakfast the next day. Thinking of no refrigeration and using as much things as possible. And that's where a lot of, preserving and curing and smoking came into play. But all of those things were rolled over into the next day. And then even if you had guests, that was the same difference. They might have, enjoyed griddle cakes made of corn, but also they'd be eating luncheon meats from the night before. That's
interesting. And then what style was the eating then? You and I've spoken before about the different styles for meals, but could you talk a little bit about how they approach that?
Yeah, so I think comparing to what we know today as eating, like when we go out to eat or we even have dinner at our own houses, is a Russian style of service, which came into play in the 19th century. And that consists of courses of food and plates and dishes being removed as you proceed and progress into the meal. Now, what the 18th century was broken down to is à la française and à la anglaise. The latter one, the anglaise, wasn't used quite as often. And sometimes in the 18th century, you saw a mix of à la française and à la anglaise. The English service was consistent of servers actually, on one end, you might have had a soup and they would be serving soup to you. And then on the opposite end of the table, they would have, say, a meat carving station, or, roasted duck or roasted poultry. And that would be sliced and served to you. Now, a la Francais was a variety of dishes and sides all at the same time, but you would eat almost as in a buffet style as you would serve yourself. Most of the times they were passed, and the guests would feed themselves and help themselves. We know that today as a buffet.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Now, obviously, holidays were important, celebrations were important as they are today. And so we know from the records at Mount Vernon that Washington had many, many guests. He and Martha entertained many people. In the new room, that large dining room was probably the scene of many fine meals. But could you talk a little bit about feasts or celebrations, perhaps? What else on a night like that with many guests? What would the house may have looked like? Or perhaps if the Washingtons went into Alexandria for the evening and attended parties, which we know that to be the case.
Yeah, one of the most well-known feasts was documented by Joshua Brooks in 1799 in February, which that time of year you're also looking at seasonality. So you're looking at some lamb and boiled leg of pork and lots of roasted meats. And usually the way they finished a meal was candied jellies or creams or sweetmeats. And now when they would go into town, say Alexandria, which Washington was quite frequent to, he also attended large-scale barbecues, which back in that sort of day, we think as barbecue today as, a giant pig roasted over a smoked and wood, and it wasn't too much different. And these large gatherings were usually accompanied by games of cards, which he frequently wrote in his journal that, I attended a barbecue, stayed all night, and won 2 or 3 shillings. That was the ladder of importance, was to attend these parties and note when you won money and didn't lose money. There was also an interesting feast, which turtle was quite frequent up and down the Virginia coast, and delicacies in Philadelphia were these giant turtle feasts. And he's known to attend one of these in Alexandria with the members of his Potomac Company,
which was the canal company that he was involved with. Yeah.
Right.
And at one of those, didn't he early on, I think probably before the war, the hosts of one party he went to didn't really have a lot of food out or the proper napkins. And he referred to that in a humorous way, what he called that evening.
Right.
Do you recall what he called that?
I'm trying to remember now, but it was quite humorous.
It's interesting when you can find those moments of levity in Washington, because there's so much serious writing that he did. And I think I enjoy when you can come across like the reference about the butter. He wonders why he has to, purchase butter. And I think some of those things come through the papers, and you can see the human side of him where he pokes a little fun at the dinner party.
Oh, most definitely. And, sort of going along with the upcoming holiday season, I mean, 12th Night was a giant display of food, and kind of an impressing matter that, is almost social class standing on, how your table was dressed at that point in time. And, since his marriage also happening, on the eve of 12th Night, that it was almost double the celebration. And, most commonly we see pictures, in Dining with the Washingtons, you see the giant standing Yorkshire pie that's just layered with different meats. And I think what everybody really doesn't understand is these pies were gigantic. They needed to be, reinforced 1 to 2 inches thick of pastry, that it needed to stand up to all the meat that was inside of it. It was almost like as if a turducken of the 18th century was, formed inside of this standing crust. And, it was quite impressive Um, I know in the 1780s, he refers to in a letter that, he talks about these pies, and he establishes a point that's, they didn't implement such a way. They didn't have any effect on the pie. Like, people ate and ate, and it wasn't getting any smaller.
Well, you mentioned that point about that 12th night and going into winter.
Mm-hmm.
The issue of preserving food in the 18th century is a tricky one, isn't it? I mean,
Oh, it
I've
is.
heard of it, the winter referred to as the starving time, in that the gardens and the produce from the farm aren't coming in at that time. So it is a lot
Yeah.
of meat, isn't it? A lot
Yeah,
of
it
meat.
is. In the fall is traditional time to butcher your hogs, because with no refrigeration, you have that cold temperature outside to protect you against bacteria and pathogens. Now, maybe not all of those things escaped, and that's why they reinforced it with salt, and or smoking, or both. And these things, that would hang in the smokehouse traditionally, in the 18th century, smoking. If you look at a smokehouse, from top to bottom, which Mount Vernon has a great reconstruction of it, from the top of the roof till the bottom, you actually rotate those hams, moving closer towards the ceiling, so they can get the most smoke and then less smoke as time moves on. And then what that does is it just prevents bacteria. And, a Virginia style ham has lots of black pepper, and people think that's for flavor, but it was really to keep the bugs away.
Really?
They didn't like that stingy taste, when bugs would attach themselves to meat. And then being stacked in barrels, you had to have something protect it if it was being shipped, if it was going on, long voyages, or you were just storing it for a long amount of time. And salting helped that, which, most fish were salted, and salting just depletes moisture and also prevents that bad bacteria from entering. Another way was fat capping. They would render down hogs and beef fat. They would render that down and then cap crocks with it. So there was actually no chance of things getting out, but at the same time, you're not letting anything come in that's bad, but you're not, it's kind of like the reverse. Sometimes it works today in like aging meats when you cap something, but when you put something in a crock and you cap it with fat, it better be already cooked, and it doesn't have to have any oxygen or airflow in it, because it could be spoiled when you crush that fat cap, and you might not even know that for 2 or 3 months. And vinegar is the same way. Vinegar was commonly used with beef and pork, aboard ships, shipping salted beef and salted pork up and down the coast, especially into the West Indies. Those kind of things, they didn't know if they went bad until until you opened up that crock, and there might be a terrible cause of spoiled meat. A big downfall of the early part of Edward Braddock's trip, which started in Alexandria, was spoiled meat.
Yeah.
And it had been in the storehouse, and nobody had checked it, and it went bad.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Braddock, and of course, we think about the Revolution and the struggle that the Army had for supplies throughout the whole campaigns.
Right.
And Washington is unique, I think, as a military leader, in that today a military leader usually has to worry about combat and maybe supplies of munitions. Washington had to write letters about all the supply of the Army, and even in the French and Indian War, the same.
Yeah.
So it's amazing the amount of documentation on the letters he wrote trying to provision that army. So obviously, with the Revolution oncoming, it changes Washington's life. It changed the dynamic for what is now America, obviously. And how does that impact? Obviously, during the war, there have been huge shortages, but after we come out of the Revolution, there is a patriotic trend. I know that's true in spirits, where you see the consumption of rum go down and whiskey grows. It was always on the scene, but it grows even more as a distinctively American product. And I'll bet that's true in other areas of food after the Revolution.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, one for sure is cheese. because cheese was a giant import of all of the wealthy, not only in Virginia, but all the colonies. And after the Revolution, you start to see production of American-made cheeses. For instance, especially in New England, which is, sort of timing with now what we know is, some of the best cheddar in the United States comes from New England, comes from Vermont.
Right.
And it was sort of the same thing, Washington, I know, states in a letter to Lafayette that he doesn't want to rely on English goods anymore, and American cheese is just as good, and American-made porter is just as good. He was getting cheese from not only various parts of New England and Rhode Island, and the same with the porter beer. But I think also, biscuits and bread production. There was a large importation of those before the American Revolution. Barrels and barrels of buttered biscuits and rusk, which is like a twice baked, almost like a sweet biscotti type bread, and even things like gingerbread. And Alexandria was a giant hub of that. By the end of the 1820s, there was 65 bakeries in Alexandria.
That's unbelievable.
And it's just a giant influx. And there was people producing things that after the War of 1812, England was importing from America, such as, biscuits and little buttered breads. A lot of those things were produced in Alexandria. I think the other thing that you start to see with food is the influence, and you always kind of saw it from the beginning, but the influence of the enslaved cook having on cuisine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the invention of American cuisine lies in the, hands of the enslaved cooks. They're what started a movement, especially in the southern states, in Virginia and the Carolinas. You start to see the Virginia kitchen, the Carolina rice kitchen. All those things were influenced by the West Indies and West Africa. And you start to see a creation of a cuisine that just really progresses in the 19th century, but it really starts to happen towards the end.
Could you maybe be a little more detailed about one or two items that came out of that era that have that sort of influence of the African Americans in the kitchen that developed in America?
Yeah, sure. I mean, rice is a definitive one, for sure. Rice is now a part of so many different cultures, and the usage of corn. I mean, corn was a North American crop. It had been here for thousands of years, used by natives and indigenous peoples, and then adapted by enslaved cooks for fabulous dishes. Griddle cakes and cornbread, and even okra. Okra is a giant crop that very drought resistant and salt resistant, and the same thing with greens. Greens just kind of were planted to remove the salinity from the soil so it could be better for rice and peas. And that's how a lot of these dishes started, like Hoppin' John with rice and peas and collard greens, and all those things kind of were brought to the table by enslaved cooks. They were the shining light of American cuisine at the end of the 18th century. Creativity was, very much frowned upon, but those dishes worked themselves into the seams of America. And, the use of cookbooks was, I think, more of a tendency of the wealthy to establish social class. It wasn't, the cookbooks weren't for anybody to follow, except the ideas that came from them. And a lot of those dishes, 1790s was the first cookbook that was, written and published in America, Amelia Simmons. And those recipes, were the first ones that contain American ingredients, even though the people were adapting English cookbooks in the 1750s and 60s when they were being reprinted in Williamsburg. They were adapting those to modern, American ingredients, but I don't think you see the influx until the 1780s and 90s after the Revolution.
Well, then how about those hired servants that may have worked in the kitchen, and not just at Mount Vernon, but in that period? What obviously people are coming to the Americas from all cultures in Europe.
Right.
I'm sure you think of where you're originally from in Pennsylvania. You think of the Welsh, the Swedes, even
Yeah.
the Pennsylvania Dutch, which were German. All of
Right.
that had to feed into what developed into some form of American cuisine around Philadelphia or around other cities. Is that really kind of how that developed?
Yeah, I mean, as hired white servants, I think a majority of their duties, sometimes their duties were um, working hand in hand with people like Frank Lee to overlook meal prep at Mount Vernon.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the background of those people had influence because, you have a lot of indentured servants that are past their indenture and they actually get hired in, a lot of them being Irish, a lot of them being from Scotland or English, or even Welsh. And, it's kind of through Virginia, you can kind of cut down the Great Wagon Road, which cuts down into North Carolina and the top part of South Carolina. And that's where those people eventually settled. But, for the first part before the Revolution, they might have been indentured going into white hired servants at plantations in Virginia. So that influence was probably felt as well.
And it's interesting because you and I have spoken before about the migration of foods, the migration of
Right.
grains across the centuries through people migrating.
Right.
They bring ideas, but they also bring the tools of certain trades that you can see are influenced by their background. And of course, it's interesting how you've connected all that through the cuisine. And I know that you worked last summer, I think, on a book you're developing, which takes a lot of Washington recipes that are known and kind of bringing them forward. And I know that's a work in progress, but maybe you could touch on a little bit of what you learned about the eating at Mount Vernon and what took place that you thought was interesting.
Yeah, I'm actually the fellowship that was on. I guess it'll be like a year and a half ago. It I actually had a office mate, George Goodwin, who's an excellent researcher and historian and author of a few books, and we decided kind of together that we would take on the task of going through journals and diaries and the financial papers, and not so much looking for recipes that already existed, but for things that were described, and we would do our own sort of culinary archaeology. And with my cooking background, and his historical background, kind of piece together what that would look like, and then how we adapt that to, a modern cook. And, the basis of the book is going to be a mini biography through the lens of food for George Washington, which it's a very different approach, that it's not taking recipes that were technically from the 18th century, but piecing together, he had a hind quarter of bison that was, when he was on the frontier in southwestern Pennsylvania. So what does that look like to, the home cook? Where can I get bison these days? Which was actually quite a few really good farms in Virginia that do great bison. How do I piece together that so somebody would enjoy making it at home for a dinner party? And in the current situation we're in, how would somebody feel about if they were trying to make those dishes with all this downtime that people seem to have?
Yeah. Well, it's intriguing. And I know everyone who is aware that you're working on that with George is looking forward to the book, because the staff got to be imbibers in a lot of these meals you cook, because you were running through, did trial run there at our kitchen at Mount Vernon, not the historic kitchen, but one of the buildings. So that was good for all the staff. Some days early on, I think the early comers got all the food, and you had to send an email out saying that, please, please reduce your portions.
That's right. It's a sampling, not a la francais, not a buffet.
Exactly. So let's go a little bit further now and talk about these big feasts and parties, and maybe how spirits kind of factored into that. We know the famous cherry bounce punch that Martha made. And
Right.
of course, rum punches and drinks with a lot of other items in that punch were very popular pre-revolution and probably post-revolution, right?
Oh yeah. We kind of first see that it's first documented that Washington has rum punch. At least the first time he writes about it is in 1748 when he goes as a young surveyor um, over the mountains towards the Blue Ridge to survey for Lord Fairfax. And he goes to a tavern. He has this rum punch, and the basis of what we know as rum punch today. Back then it was potent because a lot of the things, whether it was to cover something up or cover the disgust of the liquor itself, you do find a lot of citrus because there was citrus being imported and traded through the West Indies. A lot of lemons and limes, and then the liquors involved, and some of those were brandy and rum and whiskey, and not just one or two. It was all three of them.
Right.
And the basis of these recipes being tea. Instead of what we do today is we'll take juice and make that the base, but tea kind of knocks down the citrus a little bit, also provides some acidity and a little bit of balance for the harshness of probably what that alcohol was.
And I think that there was probably some difference in what they term continental rum,
Right,
made off molasses, versus the rum that would have been imported from the islands that would have been the sugar cane.
right.
And so there certainly was quality differences, but again, back then we didn't have the brands that we have today. You didn't know where it may have originated, and you probably didn't know who the man selling it to you, if he was passing it as off as what it actually was from.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned porter beer. Washington loved porter beer. We know that's in the records.
Right.
But people always ask about wine in early America, and from what I've studied, that there was really not a grape varietal in that period that they found that could survive this sort of climate.
Right.
What would you like to say about wine and how that fits into the scheme? I know, like, Jefferson imported so much wine, but how would you place that at these events and these dinners and these parties?
Yeah, I think Jefferson was a great spokesperson for all of these things with wine, because he tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed, and I think the effort of him trying was probably more important than nobody trying at all, because eventually, I mean, we know today that Virginia makes some pretty good wine, and they were successful over time. But there was an early attempt of a person that was introduced to him that actually lived very close to him, to Monticello, that had an idea to start a small agricultural company and start off with wine, but unfortunately it was halted short due to the Revolution. It was 1774, and everything was kind of on a downward slope at that point in time, and a lot of his initial investors, with Jefferson being one of them, and even George Washington being one of them, a lot of the investors were of English descent, and very not so much for American independence. So that sort of faltered through the way, and gave way until the 1780s and 1790s. Now, I do think that smaller places that weren't on a commercial scale were definitely trying to grow and make their own wine, and we know this from some of the records of larger plantations, even that of like Stratford Hall with the Lees, with their inventory as well.
Yeah, those inventories are interesting because we know, upon Washington's death, we can read how much wine he did have in the basement of the mansion,
Right.
and whiskey, rum, brandies. I know the letter I always found interesting. He sent some Virginia hams to Marquis de Lafayette's
Yep.
wife, and he told Lafayette that I had sought some brandy, but could not find any in Virginia that would meet to the standards of French.
Right.
And I've read letters about that, vice versa, that Europeans would often say that the brandy in Virginia was not aged long enough. I guess they didn't realize we've barely aged it at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct.
But yeah, the Lee family is interesting. For me, as you know, having worked at Stratford Hall before I came to Mount Vernon, it's another family that was vital to the Revolution, from Richard Henry and Francis Lee being signers of the Declaration, and it's wonderful that we have that correspondence in the archives at Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
And the Lee family papers about, particularly Richard Henry Lee and George Washington, corresponded tremendous amount
Right.
about politics, but also about farming and agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the benefits of an institution like Mount Vernon with the library and the work that's done there, is the preservation of these documents and acquisition of them for scholars from all angles. And as you and I have talked about, people look at it from different angles. You look at a document and what you see, and as you've taught me a lot about grain, even though I'm a miller, I've learned a lot about the early grains. So, with what you cook, it's a great experience to bring it to life. And then, I wanted to maybe touch a little bit on, before we go to questions, about Christmas pies as we're entering the holiday season. And maybe you could talk a little bit maybe about what you're going to do these weekends at Mount Vernon upcoming, and then how would they celebrate food-wise at a mansion like Mount Vernon?
Yeah, the Christmas pies, as I was kind of stating earlier, that these things were in standing crusts, which when you think about a Christmas pie or a Yorkshire pie, that English style pie, it's basically layers and layers of different kinds of fowl. So there could be duck, chicken, there could be guinea fowl, there could be turkey, and all those things interlayered. And I think to understand how big these things were, you would also layer them with fat, as we talked about preserving earlier with fat capping. So inside of that pie, as I was doing research for, various Christmas and Yorkshire pies, it was layered with fat, basically butter and beef fat. Each layer would get a coating over top of it. So, when it would bake, it would keep all the meat moist, but, after you would let it cool and they would cut it, say to serve it for the meal, it would encapsulate this meat, which would not only store it for days upon days, it would also just be, the heaviest piece of pie you've ever eaten because of all the fat. And, these things could range from, 12 to 14 inches high, and even larger. And in diameter, you're talking 18 to maybe 24 inches wide.
That was my next question. I wanted to get an idea of how big.
It depends on what kind of form they were using to set it in, but some of them were quite large, and they were making, 5 or 6 of these, and they would just come to the table and be set down. And, like he said, there would be hardly make an impression on one. And I'm trying to think, even if 2 slices were gone, it would look like nothing. And 2 slices could probably feed 6 people,
Oh my God.
because they were so giant. And just think of like the different layers of meat. And, very rarely was there vegetables, maybe turnips, and sometimes they put apples inside, dried apples. But, very rarely was there more than just meat, fat, and crust, which is quite interesting. But sort of to change into the upcoming event at Mount Vernon, their new event this year, it's called Winter Glow, with an illumination of the mansion. I'll be there with Half Crown Bakehouse in my oven, and we'll be making our traditional loaves that were made from the white Lamasse wheat that Washington grew. We'll also have that by the slice, and then we're doing a black cake from Barbados, which has an interesting story that as it made its way to the Caribbean from England, it was traditionally the plum pudding, like a steamed plum pudding with currants and raisins and soaked fruit with brandy. And then when it made its way to the Caribbean, it got the influence of molasses, and it got the influence of rum, and those things, kind of cooked down, turned the color of the cake a dark black. So with the influence of that and all the fruits in the West Indies, it became black cake. Plum pudding became black cake in the Caribbean. And so we'll have a little miniature version of that. And then we'll have some gingerbread that is from one of the few lists of ingredients that was found from Christopher Ludwig, who is the superintendent of baking for the Continental Army. After Washington realized that they could not withstand provisioning by just a company of bakers, they needed somebody that was in charge. And in the Morristown camp, Washington gets a list of ingredients plus a bill from Christopher Ludwig for a barrel of gingerbread. So we've recreated that with the exact ingredients, and we'll be having that as well those nights.
Well, that's going to be great for members and other people that come to Mount Vernon this holiday season, and being an outdoor experience, it's going to be really a unique set of evenings. So we're glad you can be part of it. And I think with that, we've gone about a little over 30, 40 minutes, and maybe we should try to open it up and see if some of the members have some questions for you.
Yeah.
And we do have a question here from Cynthia Miller, and she says, hello. And did George Washington attend these barbecues or turtle feasts for strategic or networking purposes, purely social reasons, or a little bit of both?
That's a great question, Cynthia. So I think actually we can tie these events back to one trip for young Washington in Barbados, because he was 19 years old. He went with his half brother Lawrence to try to cure tuberculosis. But in going to Barbados, he learned the strategies of the social elite. And he also learned from a military standpoint of what he wanted to be. And he attended various beef and tripe club meetings when he didn't have smallpox in Barbados, which was not that much time. But I think that point in time influenced how he networked and how he strategized pretty much throughout his life, because he saw all these people of the social elite, especially military standing. And if he got everybody, and I think this was the practice, honestly, of the 18th century, of that kind of person, that, when you get all these people in one room, especially when you gather around food or drink, the networking is quite enormous. And the things, especially clubs, Ben Franklin was a big believer in those, in societies, that, when you get people of different backgrounds sort of meeting together, that, ideas are formed. And especially I think Washington used those because he threw a couple barbecues of his own, not only attending one in Alexandria, he threw one down by the Accotink Creek as well. And the turtle feast, I'm sure there was more behind that than let's go eat some turtle with the Potomac Company. I'm sure that there was scheming and plotting all together. It's a great question.
That is. Yeah. And a little bit of libation, and people might loosen up a little bit to learn more information or be able to have the discussions
exactly
a little more deeper. Yeah. Let's see if we have any more questions for you, Justin. I may mispronounce your name, so I'm sorry on the spelling. So I'll just read the question. Forgive me. Chef Cherry, did almost all the food taste smoky, including baked desserts? That's a good question.
So it really depends on how you're doing that cooking. I think, yeah, I also do think that everything did taste probably a little bit smoky. I mean, not on purpose, but just because of, you know, you have these styles of cooking, open hearth, down hearth, and you're also using bake ovens that were attached to the hearth, sort of on the side of the hearth. So what would happen is, yeah, they would get smoky fumes going in there as well with heat. I think it's something you can't avoid. But I think the desserts, I mean, you don't ever read about anybody complaining about the smokiness of it. But desserts, if they were baked, you know, down hearth style, you're going to have a lid closed on that. And you're going to be baking not only from underneath it, but you're going to have coals on top of it. Now, if it's going in the bake oven up top, where usually like bread or small rolls, I think that smoke would definitely roll up in there because you would remove the ash most of the time. And some of the time, the ovens were so closely connected that the heat itself from the hearth would provide enough into that little side oven. You wouldn't need to rake out your coals. And you wouldn't have that smoky taste. But no, that's a great question.
Cynthia has another question for you here. Hello, how drunk did the men get at these different parties that were held? And are there any major Rev War decisions that were made whilst they were drinking heavily? Well, if they were drinking heavily, they're probably not too good decisions, but
yeah.
I think the 18th century is replete with stories of drunken behavior, I would say. Wouldn't you say, Justin?
Yeah, I would think that, you know, during some of these campaigns, especially in the winter, when they're making decisions for how the campaign would proceed, yeah, I think they would. I think there's probably some bad decisions were made, but I think most people withstood, you know, withheld these because, you know, I think other occasions, probably not during the Revolutionary War and probably some of the Revolutionary War. But I think more often, I think you're likely to see that sort of thing happening at, you know, local elections.
Yeah,
because food and drink played a heavy part in that.
Yeah.
Because most people won and lost elections by what food or drink they had with them. And Washington learned that early when he lost the first House of Burgesses. I just don't think his liquor or his cakes were any good that he had.
And we have that listing of the next time he ran of the expenses on alcohol, as they called it, treating. But I think it's true too that on average people drank a lot more in the 18th century.
Right.
One of the issues there is water and waterborne disease. And Washington's records or letters are replete with times where he knew the men needed the alcohol ration, but also he would talk about moderation and temperance at certain times. So I think he saw both sides of it and knew that the army needed it, but they also needed to be fit to fight. But that's a good question.
Yeah, that's awesome.
See if we have another one. Cynthia, again, she says, not sure if you all spoke about this, but are there any recipes or foods that Washington particularly liked, handed down from his mother, that he also wanted to have served, wanted to be sure they were served at Mount Vernon?
You know, I think particularly it's very hard to track, and especially Washington, as I've found out in the last year and a half or so. You know, the stuff that he ate wasn't so much documented as, say, somebody else. So like Jefferson is a lot more better documented with food. Now, I haven't found anything that was really handed down from his mother. That early life at, Ferry Farm and Pope's Creek, there's not too much documentation on that. So, you know, it's rather hard. I mean, they did some archaeology at Ferry Farm and revealed some grain, some corn and some wheat, which were all pretty common back in then. So I really can't tie anything or to that exact question.
There's the reference, and it's been a long time since I've looked at the primary source, but that he did love hoe cakes.
Right. Right.
And he loved honey on them and butter on them. So,
Yep. That's been documented not only by his step grandchildren, but also visitors throughout the 1790s. That was one thing that he loved was hoe cake swimming in butter and honey.
mm-hmm. Let's see if we have another question here. Are there examples of special food that might only be consumed once a year?
There might be special foods, but it would probably be tied to religious holidays. I'm trying to think really in general. I mean, it wasn't so much like today where you have this special thing that you only eat once a year, which, especially with Thanksgiving coming up and Christmas, we attach turkeys to Thanksgiving and we attach hams to Christmas. And these things, I think as time proceeded, turkeys became a special thing, but, back then turkeys were quite prominent and you saw them on the dinner table all the time. Especially with hams as well. I think it's more of a modern approach that, we reserve specialty foods for certain things. And I think that in time there probably was, like maybe they only had, like the Christmas pies is a good example. Maybe they were more luxurious for then, but all throughout the year, they would probably be eating some form of that pie. It just wouldn't be as grand. It might not contain as many bits of fowl. It might have pork or beef in it instead. They might be smaller. But that is a good example of a specialty food were those Christmas pies.
We have time for a couple more questions here, Justin. So, Justin, you talked about rolling over meals from the day before. How would the food preparation change?
So we're talking about, again, those early version of what we know as lunch meats, but they called them butcher meats back then. So more often than not, hams and lambs and roasts were all carved. How thick, how thin, we don't quite know, but when a variety of those things were sliced, they would just save them for the next day. With the amount of fat on them up top from roasting, I would probably preserve them. Maybe a little bit of cheesecloth or linen draped overward to keep out of, to keep bugs off and whatnot, especially in like a larder room. And then for breakfast, it wouldn't change much. Most often they wouldn't even be heated up. They'd be eating them cold. And sometimes they were even, I know Washington a couple times on occasion, it seems like he took things with him, which on his rides to the farm, which might in fact be those butcher meats. And they also talk about those in the Revolution. A lot of officers ate those not only for dinner, but for the next day's meal as well.
Well, and we have time for one last question, I think. Oh, it's a great one to end on. What's your personal favorite 18th century food to prepare?
I love making pies, the savory kind, and I think I really fell in love with doing things that were sort of out of the ordinary. But I love a steak and kidney pie. I'm a big believer in nose to tail cookery, as all 18th century people were, and the kidneys in the pie with some turnips and even some apples and hard-boiled eggs. Some of those things really play off on each other well in a baked pie. That's definitely one of my favorites.
Now, as we get to the end of our live stream, Justin, I just want to thank you for all the work at Mount Vernon on the ground that you've done, different events and your research as well. But want to remind members to come out for the Winter Glow programs, and you can meet Justin in person if you haven't already, and see the oven in action. It's quite an operation. You all don't know the work that goes on behind the scenes at night to produce what he does in that oven. So when the crowd's gone and everything's thinned out, he's still working and preparing for the next day. So please make the time to visit us whenever you can. We love seeing everybody back on the estate. And these weekends coming up with Winter Glow and Illumination are going to be quite beautiful ones. And the added experience of food at the oven is going to bring a lot for the enjoyment of everybody. So Justin, thanks. And it's always good to chat about these issues, these topics, and hope we can do it again. And again, all the crew at the distillery misses you cooking for them as you did last year when we had the whiskey event. But hopefully 2021 will bring that back. So
yeah, thank you all for having me. I very much appreciate it. And the fellowship program down there, working with y'all at trades and at the distillery, and doing research, and it's really brought what I do kind of full circle. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's compelling work, and again, peeling back another layer of the Washington's lives that we sometimes don't think of. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and to our colleagues at the media and the library for helping us out tonight. So with that, we'll close out the evening, and hope you all will join another live stream soon, and wish everybody a happy